Okay, so today I'm going to be taking you through Carol Rumens' poem The Emigrée, and just going to talk you through some of the key structural features, the key methods that Rumens uses to communicate her ideas. Okay, so the first thing to mention about this poem in terms of its structure is that this is a poem that is written in free verse. There's no set rhyme scheme, there's no regular or consistent metre. The poem takes place in an almost conversational tone, which makes us feel very close to the person speaking, the emigré, who's mentioned in the title of the poem. We can assume that the persona in this poem, the narrator, is female because of the feminine form of the word emigré, which is given in the title of the poem. But other than that, Rumens doesn't give us any clues as to who this person is, the country that she's come from, or indeed what specifically has happened, which has meant that she has to leave her country. In that way, the persona becomes a universal figure, representing all those who are displaced by war or by tyrants. So this poem deals overall with the theme of displacement, the idea that there are people around the world who are forced to, as a result of war, as a result of conflict, leave their homes, and in this case, the country that the persona has left is somewhere that she remembers really, really fondly, despite all of the hardship that it's evidently going through today. So we'll have a look at this poem a line at a time, and as we go through, I will pick out and annotate for you some of the key methods that Rumens uses and some of the key ideas that are communicated throughout. So we begin with this short phrase, "There once was a country," which is followed by the ellipsis here. And this initial phrase has almost a fairy tale quality to it. "There once was a country," echoing the language of fairy tales, once upon a time, which creates this kind of childlike tone right from the very outset of the poem. But the ellipsis marks the moment of transformation. We understand that this isn't going to be a fairy tale story, that the country isn't akin to anything that we might read about in children's tales. So immediately we have the presentation of quite a childlike perception, and that runs throughout this initial stanza, this first stanza. So after this ellipsis, the emigré explains, "I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear." And we see this word sunlight repeated again and again throughout this poem, at the end of each of these stanzas, here, here, and again right at the end. And that word, sunlight, is a recurring motif. A motif, an image that recurs throughout the poem, and it comes to represent positivity, it comes to represent optimism, and each time that it recurs throughout the poem, we see that this is a poem about really the endurance of the human spirit. Despite the fact that this persona has been forced out of her home country, despite the fact that she's struggling to assimilate into her new environment, she retains that positivity and that optimism represented by the image of sunlight. So it's a recurring motif symbolising optimism and positivity. Now, when we've spoken about this in class, we've talked about the fact that obviously there are multiple different interpretations of the word light, that symbol of light. We've spoken as well about innocence and kind of naivety possibly as well. And all of those, again, are valid interpretations here as well. So, my memory of it is sunlight clear. This creates a sense that this is a bright and vivid memory. So despite everything that's happened, she recalls her home country really vividly, although we might argue that perhaps she sees it through a slightly rose-tinted, slightly falsely, naively positive perception. But my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I'm told, comes to the mildest city. So in these words here, that November which comes to the mildest city, this is giving us the sense that there was an incident, there was an event, there was some moment of transformation, altering the way that she saw this place. So potentially this could represent the outbreak of war. This could represent a time of political and social upheaval. And we get the impression that it took place in the winter. And that winter juxtaposes these images of sunlight, which suggests something warmer, sunnier. So we might infer that this is an event such as the outbreak of war or conflict. And remember, as we're looking at each of these poems, we do need to think about how they relate to the themes, the title of this part of the collection, Power and Conflict. So we'll continue. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright, filled paperweight. Okay, I've highlighted this line again because we have another method that Rumens is using here. This is a metaphor. The bright, filled paperweight is a metaphor representing her perspective, and it creates this sense of stability, sturdiness, something permanent, something secure, the bright, filled paperweight. So something that is holding her ideas down, perhaps. Bright, again, echoing this image of sunlight that we see recurrent throughout the poem. Again, her view, her positive, optimistic view will not change despite the worst news I receive of it, despite any information to the contrary. So her positive view will not be altered. It may be at war. It may be sick with tyrants. And this word it that's repeated throughout, I never saw it in that November, the worst news I receive of it. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. The whole way through here she is speaking about her country, and it retains that anonymity. This country isn't named, and this creates a sense of universality. Just as the Emigrée herself comes to represent all displaced figures, all those who are forced from their homes by war and by conflict, here the country itself remains anonymous, suggesting that this country can represent anywhere that has been afflicted by war, by conflict. So again, another method here, and we see this throughout the poem, is the use of personification. Here used to describe the outbreak of conflict in this country, as though it is a disease. The country is made sick with tyrants, with cruel and oppressive rulers. Later on in the poem, in the third stanza, we come back to this sense of personification around her country, and there it's used to create a sense of vulnerability. So we'll just have a quick look at that now so that you can see how this sense of vulnerability of the country is developed throughout the poem. My city comes to me in its own white plain. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. So here again, we have that use of personification. And we could perhaps interpret lies down as almost a submissive gesture. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. So here's that personification again, and here we get the sense of the Emigrée, the persona, caring for and nurturing and looking after the memory of her country. And love its shining eyes. There again is that image of light and positivity. My city takes me dancing, and then my city hides behind me. So again and again, we see this personification used to create positive and joyful imagery, but also imagery of vulnerability and fragility. As though her country looks to her to defend it and to protect it. Now, I don't think here that when Rumens uses this kind of language, I'm not suggesting that the persona has to physically defend her country. I'm not saying, that she's fighting for it or something like that. I think that this is more about the way that it's seen. She fights to defend the way that her country is perceived, the way that it's looked at by others. And we'll talk again about those people who see her country in a more negative light in a moment. Okay, but let's jump back to that first stanza again. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. So we get that sense that war is like a disease, like a sickness, and that these tyrants, these rulers, are infecting and hurting and damaging the country. But nevertheless, I am branded by an impression of sunlight. And here again, we have that metaphorical language. And branded is a really fascinating word choice for Rumens to use here. It implies perhaps that the memory is scarring to the persona, that some of these ideas, some of these memories are perhaps painful. And yet, nevertheless, this seems like a positive thing. I am branded by an impression of sunlight. It suggests that these memories have a sense of permanence, that they can't change, that there's nothing she can do to eradicate her positive memories of her country. Should we come back again to that idea of sunlight? And the structural feature of repetition here, at the end of each stanza, we have the repetition of that image of sunlight, creates the impression, I think, that no matter what may happen, no matter what news she may receive of her country, no matter what those who perceive her country differently to her might say, she nevertheless holds these fond, joyful, positive, innocent, optimistic views of her country. And this as well reminds us that all of these countries that we see on the news, all of these countries that are struggling with war, with conflict, they are or were and remain the homes of those that live there. So they aren't just war zones. There's more, there's an identity, there's a culture which is often ignored. And here we're being reminded by Rumens that for these people, these displaced people, these refugees, those who are forced to flee their countries, when they look back on the places that they grew up and the places that they lived, there is perhaps this sense of internal conflict as well between the memories that they have, happy and positive ones, coming into collision with the bad news that they see, that they receive from those still living there, and that saturates the media. I digress. Moving on to stanza 2. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer. Let's just look at these three words, the white streets, the graceful slopes. So here we have this image of purity in white streets, perhaps language of innocence as well. And again, there's this sense of light and brightness, the white streets. And then we have the graceful slopes, suggesting that sense of beauty and elegance to this country. And they glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks. So there again, in this verb glow, is the image of light, suggesting these memories are almost illuminated for her. They glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us. So here time is being personified as an almost military figure. As time goes on, these tanks roll across her country and the frontiers rise between us. So as time passes and the war becomes more serious, and she feels further and further away from her country, nevertheless, she remembers this place as beautiful. The frontiers rise between us, close like waves. There's that sense here of recurrent violence, that it's ebbing and flowing, but that it is powerful as well, perhaps. So, close like waves, the use of this simile, I read this as suggestive of the ebb and flow, but also the power of this conflict. The sort of inevitability of it, just like a wave that fades away and then comes back again. The sense that it's almost an insurmountable barrier, something she can't get past. So we move on now to her reflections on leaving her country. We see this the caesura here at the end of the line, that full stop, and then she moves to discuss the child's vocabulary. And this suggests to me, when she's speaking about here, this is the country that she is living in now. This is her new home, the place that she now must live. That child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll. I love the use of this simile. Quite a simple kind of simile, but I think really quite revealing. It suggests almost that this language, her child's vocabulary, was something smuggled, a hollow doll, the language stowed away inside it. And also the use of the word doll there, the use of that image, again reminding us of her youth and her innocence. So this simile here evokes the idea of smuggling, as if she's had to hide her language away and bring it with her secretively, as though it's an illicit thing, something she shouldn't have, the language of her own country, and the use of that word doll evoking the childlike perspective that she had at the time. And it opens and spills a grammar. So the sense here of this, the fact that it's unstoppable, the fact that she can't suppress or hide away her true identity, who she really is. And she covets it as well. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. And I love this line, I love the imagery here, the suggestion that this is almost a sort of a keenness, a desperation to fully acquire her identity, to explore and to gain and to possess her full identity, the person that she was before she left her home country. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state. So this is suggesting perhaps that identity is being suppressed by the tyrants that are mentioned in that first stanza. And again, the phrase banned by the state gives us a sense of the depths of this conflict. But I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. And just look at the repetition here at the beginnings of these final lines of each stanza. Her country may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight. But, despite the harsh circumstances, she remembers it positively. Here, her language may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. There's that sense of, that this is unstoppable, that identity, that true identity can't be suppressed and can't be hidden. I can't get it off my tongue. So her identity, her language, her culture cannot be banned. It can't be forced underground. She can't be made to hide who she really is. It tastes of sunlight. When we have the kind of the combination of two senses that don't go together, we could call this it's almost synesthesia in the imagery. It tastes of sunlight. And there's that sort of slight disorientation there. But again, the use of language, the use of her language is clearly associated with that positivity and optimism. The language brings her positivity and optimism. Okay, finally, in this last stanza, I see this really as the struggles of the titular Emigrée, the persona in this poem, her struggles to assimilate. So this stanza really deals with the difficulties faced by displaced people as they try to build new homes or integrate and assimilate within unfamiliar cultures. And within this stanza, we start to hear about they. And again, this anonymous language is used to create that sense of universality. They here represent these new oppressive figures who are now afflicting the persona, who are now harming or hurting the persona in her new home, in the country she's moved to, the place she is now. We'll look at those lines more closely. I have no passport. There's no way back at all. So here there is that sense of almost being trapped I have no passport, as though she is denied an identity connecting her to her previous country. But my city comes to me in its own white plain. And this is almost dreamlike imagery in my view. Again, we have the word white, like here the white streets of that country, suggesting again that connection with positivity and happiness and purity. Its own white plane also to me sounds like a paper plane, and this is also perhaps evocative of letters that she's receiving, or communication perhaps from her home country. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. So this country here being personified as docile, gentle, harmless. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. So there's that language again of nurturing and caring for her country. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. Look at this juxtaposition. My city. The city of walls. The city of walls, suggesting barriers, suggesting separation. And we're left to infer that this is the place that she lives now. The city of walls is the place that she's moved to, and she perceives it as being filled with barriers, filled with separation. They, perhaps the inhabitants of this new country, the inhabitants of this new city that she lives in, accuse me of absence. They accuse me. And these words give us the impression that she is almost viewed as suspect, as suspicious, seen as someone who isn't blending in, who doesn't fit within the culture of this new country, this new city. They accuse me of absence, as though she is not participating in whatever the dominant culture is. They circle me, and again, here's that language. It evokes the idea of being trapped, being encircled, being closed in on and perhaps threatened. And so we have the idea of this persona, this emigrée, being vulnerable, perhaps being oppressed again. They accuse me, look at that repetition again, of being dark in their free city. Now, this is the first time that we have a word like dark or black used to contrast white, glow, sunlight. So here she's being accused of being dark, as though here in this new place she doesn't have that sense of optimism. Another interpretation of this line, some people when reading this poem read into this that there is an accusation of racism being made there, as though she's also being deemed as different, as separate, perhaps due to her race, the colour of her skin. This is again an absolutely valid viewpoint, a valid reading. We remember that for some displaced people, for some people who are forced to move, forced to emigrate from their home countries, they do often face racism, they do face prejudice. So this could be another interpretation here. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. Free in contrast to sick with tyrants at war. Here, the city is free, but we get the impression that the persona, with no way back, the persona being circled and accused, she feels anything but free. And we have the juxtaposition of her city taking her dancing, that sense of joy and positivity, and almost romance, against their free city. But she perceives it as the city of walls. So we get that sense of differing and colliding viewpoints, different interpretations, different ways of seeing the same countries. My city hides behind me, as though she is protecting it, as though it's vulnerable or fragile. She needs to look after it. She needs to do what she can to protect it from the way that it's being perceived by others. They mutter death, again perhaps referring to these people perceiving only the war that her country is suffering. They mutter death. They focus on the negative aspects, the negative things that her country is known for, whereas she looks at herself, she looks at her identity, points out her shadow and says it wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the sunlight. If there was nothing beautiful there, she wouldn't be who she is. Her shadow couldn't exist if there wasn't also light. Okay, so the poem ends, despite all its imagery of conflict throughout, the poem ends on the same image, that recurring motif of optimism and positivity. And I think really here the view that Rumens is exploring, first of all, she's exploring the challenges and the difficulties that are faced by all those who are forced due to conflict, due to war, to emigrate from their home countries. So in terms of your AO3, when you're thinking about this, I think your major AO3 idea that's being explored is the theme, the issue of displacement. So I would certainly focus in on that when you're thinking about the big ideas that Rumens is addressing. I think the way that she's kept her figure anonymous, the way that she has kept the country anonymous as well, helps to create this universal aspect to the poem. She deals with ideas of the difficulties that displaced people face as they try and integrate within unfamiliar cultures. But I think ultimately this is a poem which deals with perspectives. In this poem, in my view, Rumens is exploring how different people's perceptions of different countries may be, and forcing us to recognise that our perspectives of war-torn countries are really limited and really affected by the media that we consume, and by our understanding of the conflicts that we see, for example, through the news. We cannot possibly understand every subtle little nuance that makes up what a country is without having lived there, grown up there, been there. We see that what perhaps we in this country might view as our free land, our free city, not war-torn, not sick with tyrants, may feel to others like a city of walls, may seem to others like a place where they face accusations. And at the same time, a country that we think of as being associated only with death, actually for those that have lived there, grown up there, seen it in all of its beauty and complexity, may actually be more associated with sunlight. Okay, so that's my final comment on the AO3 aspect of this poem. I hope that this has been useful. Please let me know if there's any more depth and detail that you would like to talk about with regards to this poem, and I can always make a follow-up delving in a bit more depth. All right, thanks very much for watching. Happy revision!